I guess we're going to get started pretty soon. Okay, I think it's time, I believe. Let me take a look. Okay. You guys can hear me okay? Awesome. Perfect. All right. I see folks are coming in, so we'll give folks just a quick minute as we wait. Um, Super excited about this session. I'm sure you guys heard a lot of cool things this earlier this morning. I heard Paul Turner's session was really well received. A lot of good excitement updates, and including some from the VMware community. As folks are rolling in, just a couple of housekeeping rules, or just reminders actually. I have actually my colleague Alan Renouf, who's actually on the call. He'll help me field some of the questions. So feel free to ask any questions you have using the Q&A window. It just makes it easier for us to address questions, whether he's going to help answer the questions or maybe some of them will take live. So certainly encourage folks to take a look at the Q&A section. And then this is a session that we're going to talk about, some of the tips in terms of how you can take advantage of the full VCF 9 experience within a lab, prototype, POC learning environment. And so with that, let's jump right in. Let me see if this is going to work. Okay, so here's the planned agenda. We're going to talk a little bit about the capabilities and ultimately what can you do with the environment that we're going to talk about. Then we're going to quickly jump into some of the requirements. I know a lot of you are currently working on either upgrading, building, or considering purchasing a lab. And so what are some of those requirements? And then we'll talk about some reference implementations that's available to you. And then we're going to take a look at just how to quickly get started. I know for a lot of you, who haven't played with VMware Cloud Foundation, including myself. I've only started to kind of play with in the last several years. It can be a little bit daunting to get started. So we're going to try to get that started really quickly. Um, and then last, I'm going to jump into some tips and tricks that's really going to make it very easy for folks to kind of just get started, especially if you're working in a environment where you might not have all the additional resources like you would see in, say, in a production environment. So these are some things that you can quickly get started. Okay, first we're going to talk about some of the 9.0 capabilities that's going to be available to you. And one of the things that's really important as we talk about just, getting a lab environment stood up is ultimately what are you trying to accomplish? What things are you looking for? For some of you, that might be trying to optimize some of the operations that you're having to do on a daily basis, whether you're wearing an SRE, VI admin, cloud admin hat, where you're trying to operationalize things like password management, certificate management, et cetera. And how do I start to get started with some of those aspects of it, right? So really having a goal in mind. For some of you, it might be learning about some of the new modern network technologies like VCF networking, where I can start to create these VPC constructs, and how do I expose that to different types of users, lines of businesses, and really secure that connectivity. For others, it might be playing with some modern workloads, and even modernizing how you provision your workloads. Not just Kubernetes, but things like data services, and even just simply manifesting virtual machines using a more modern approach or desired state. And so one of the things that I want to make clear that all the different platform capabilities that you probably heard about this week, and even with the launch of VCF9 as a platform, is that all of these things can be achieved in a minimal lab environment. And that's something that both Alan Renouf and I had presented at Explore. And this is sort of an optimized version of that presentation that just kind of goes in the next level of detail, right? So like I said earlier, whether you're looking to operationalize some of the day two things from patching, lifecycle management, security, compliance, to playing with some of the new services that we've talked about, data service manager to manifest, database workloads, whether you're trying to optimize workload provisioning and changing and optimizing that for how you might deploy within your organization, and just taking a look at some of the new out-of-the-box capabilities from VCF. Maybe some of you have heard a lot about AI. And you can certainly do some really interesting things using the new private AI services that's part of the VCF solution stack. So, going into this with, some goal in mind, what are you trying to do? And that really helps you understand, what are the areas and ultimately what are the requirements, and have a goal at the end of the road, right? That way you can kind of build on that level set and ultimately what you're trying to achieve when you're thinking about, setting up an environment. A lot of times we kind of get stuck on just building the environment, and we don't think about, well, how are we going to use that environment, right? But again, here, all the capabilities that you've seen and heard about this week can be accomplished in this environment. In fact, this is something that I've done myself as I've been starting to play with some of these services. Okay, So with that out of the way, let's talk about some of the resource requirements. And while this is specifically for 9.0, this also covers the most recent patch release, which is our 9.0.1 release. And it has a number of enhancements and capabilities, and you'll hear a little bit about that when we talk about the tips and tricks. At a very high level, for the initial VCF9 deployment, you're really looking at these particular components. One of the nice things about 9.0 compared to, say, 5.x is that in the past, you had to deploy, multiple instances of some of these components, like, say, NSX Manager. And when you go through the VCF installer, which is this new component that allows you quickly stand up the full VCF9 stack, you can decide whether you want a singleton or you want a clustered solution. So if you're just getting started, you really want to deploy the minimal or use the minimal amount of resources. We've optimized that from an installer standpoint. So here you can see the different components that's needed to bring up that full VCF9 experience, from the core CDC components all the way to our operations and automation components. Now, the most common, lowest common denominator here from a resource standpoint is really going to be that VCF automation stack. It's going to require at least 24 vCPU. And what that means is that from a physical hardware standpoint, you're going to want to have a system that has at least 12 cores that gives you 24 threads so that you can provision that workload. And then obviously the memory requirements you can see across the board. So as you think about the hardware that you have today, and maybe that new hardware you're looking to consider, this is going to be one of those things that you're just going to have to take a look at and make sure that you're able to meet those requirements. Oops. Okay. Now, the prior slide just talked about just sort of the initial deployment. Now, obviously, we want to consume and start to leverage these different services. Like I said, whether you're playing with the new VPC constructs, maybe you want to learn about some of the new VCF services from DSM to some of the VKS Kubernetes constructs to even just modernize workloads. And so to be able to consume some of those resources, obviously, you'll need some additional components. And so here you're seeing the prior table. And really what we're adding here is the NSX edges. And also we can now deploy our vSphere supervisor, which typically used to be deployed in 3 nodes, and you had to kind of do some overrides. And again, we wanted to make it very simple for you to get the experience of the full VCF9 stack without requiring a whole lot of resources. So here again, we can deploy in an optimized fashion. So these are the additional resources that's required on top of what you need to deploy. So just a quick snapshot here. Now, obviously, we want to make sure that we've got all the NTP, DNS, and IP requirements. We kind of saw what happened with DNS a couple weeks ago. But here are just a high level in terms of just kind of deploying the minimal components, the number of nodes, and then ultimately roughly the rough number of IP addresses. Again, this is sort of the minimal set. For some of these components, you might deploy additional instances of them. You might have high availability requirements if you wanted to kind of play with that. So again, this is sort of just a minimum starting point, more of a reference than anything else here. But you get a sense of the number of IPs that's needed, and then ultimately make sure that you have DNS both forward and reverse. And now luckily the installer does do a lot of validation, and we'll talk about that in a second when we talk about how do you kind of get started. Networking requirements. Obviously, networking is a big part of any type of IT infrastructure. It can literally make or break your experience. I certainly have seen that my own self as I kind of onboarded to the VCF construct. The nice thing about that is to deploy the full VCF stack that we talked about. You really just need 5 VLANs, right? We're already familiar with many of these things, right? Are typically our management VLAN. It can be any VLAN IDs. These are the VLANs that I'm currently using in my own home environment. But you want to have some type of a routing capability, whether it's BGP or you can even do static routing. Today, I'm doing static routing just for simplicity purposes. So you can get started with very minimal networking, but you will need at least a minimum of 5 VLANs to get started with. Like I said, the management network, your vMotion network, and then your vSAN or some alternative storage network. We'll talk about some of the options there. And then we do configure the tunnel endpoints automatically for you. So this is for your ESX host. And then if you decide to deploy the edges, we'll go ahead and leverage that same VLAN. And then obviously for northbound connectivity, your T0 uplink that gets the VPC traffic in and out of your infrastructure out into the physical network or into other networks, we'll need an additional VLAN. So 5 VLANs that you can easily provision. And again, I have some blog posts that kind of talks about the setup and configuration, but pretty straightforward that you just need these 5 VLANs and you're able to deploy the full VCF9 stack going from there. Now, these are the kind of the minimal requirements. I will flash up sort of what I'm doing today, and these are just examples, not meant to be the only option. But when you look at my particular setup, I do have a routing switch that has 10 gigabit connectivity. You can get away with lower connectivity, but if you're doing a lot of replication, if you're running vSAN, we really highly recommend 10 gigabits. And certainly, as you look at production workloads, we certainly require 10 gigabit, if not 25 gigabit in terms of production workloads. But here I've got several physical hosts that's wired up to my router. And I do have an additional switch that allows me to connect to my Synology data store. This is actually running as my ISO store, my content library, and also my offline depot, which I'll talk about in a second. And then obviously, if you have other devices that you want to connect up here, in my environment, I have 3 hosts that is made up of basically my management cluster, and that's where we're going to deploy the VCF stack. So again, just an example of what I'm doing today. Many folks are using something similar or following a similar build of material that I can share at a later point. So what's sort of the minimal deployment stack that you can kind of deploy VCF9? That's a common question that I get on a regular basis. And the interesting thing is that, certainly in production, you can deploy n number of hosts for availability, but you can actually get down to a single physical host. So I'll repeat that again. You can actually deploy the full VCF9 stack, all the different capabilities that I talked about, even on a single host. Now, there's definitely some override flags that you can apply. So out of the box, the product's going to ensure that you run this in a highly available mode for obvious reasons. But from a POC learning standpoint, right, if you have a host that can meet all the requirements that we talked about earlier, that has sufficient memory, and ultimately that's really what you're going to be bounded by is the amount of available physical memory that you have to allocate, you can run this on a single host. And from a storage standpoint, I can certainly do vSAN, and we all know you can do vSAN even on a single node. Now, obviously, there won't be any availability from that standpoint because you've just got a single node. But again, if you just want to bring up something quickly, you can do that using vSAN, or you might use external storage. We do support fiber channel VMFS storage, or we can do VMFS or NFS, sorry. And then on top of that, we're able to deploy what we refer to as the VCF fleet components, right? So that's our VCF automation, our operation. So those are single instances. And then we're going to deploy the management domain. So earlier shared with you the vCenter server, SCDC manager, our NSX manager, and the different operations components, right? So this is sort of what a single host deployment would look like. There is no nested virtualization. This is all deploying as if you're deploying right into production, which has a huge benefit because how you're deploying it right now really gives you that hands-on experience in terms of how you would deploy that into a production environment. Now, given some of the hardware that I've seen folks use, including myself, it might be difficult to do a single host. Typically, you need to have a pretty powerful workstation or even maybe like a server grade system that has the amount of capacity. Now, more commonly, especially on some of the hardware that's available in the market, you're probably going to be able to get away with, say, like 2 hosts. And I'll talk about a reference implementation where what this looks like. But I can get away with 2 hosts. And again, I can deploy vSAN storage, right? Get all the benefits of vSAN ESA, especially some of the new snapshot technology. But again, I can also use alternative storage as well. And again, the picture here shouldn't look very differently. Obviously, I've got some NVMe devices that I want to use for vSAN, maybe NVMe tiering, especially with the prices of memory going up quite expensively these days. That technology will certainly help you. And then we can even get away with using, say, 1 gigabit networking. So again, not recommended for production, but if you wanted to do this from a POC learning standpoint, you might have gigabit connectivity. Maybe you might have multi-gigabit, like 2.5 gigabit. You can definitely use it, and there are definitely some overrides that I'll talk about in the tips and tricks section of the presentation. Now, with this, and then on top of that, it's not just deploying the management domain components, but it's about enabling all these other capabilities. So we talked about supervisor, VM services, data service manager, private AI, right? So when I talk about these minimal deployments, it's in conjunction of the initial deployment, but also how can I actually start to use the platform, right? To create things like VPCs, how do I leverage VCF automation? How do I play with Kubernetes, right? And so it's more than just standing up the stack. It's really actually using the stack and doing some interesting things with it. Now, here is my particular implementation for my minimal setup. So like I mentioned earlier, I'm using 3 physical hosts. I do have NVMe devices that I'm using to run vSAN ESA. I do have 10 gigabit networking connectivity. So that just ensures that things like vMotion, storage, everything's just as fast as possible. I'm deploying everything in singleton mode. And then I am actually turning on all of these services. In fact, most recently I played with private AI services. I was able to add a GPU into my system. and I was able to easily play with our private AI services, right? So again, depending on what outcome you're looking for, what things you're trying to play with, whether it's some of the new fleet management capabilities that comes out of VCF operations, whether you're trying to provision, modern workloads using VCF automations, playing with Kubernetes, maybe it's networking, right? You'll want to optimize the underlying hardware based on the things that you want to run. Maybe you want to deploy additional workload domains, and you want to kind of learn a little bit of automation, right? So again, having a goal in mind is really, really helpful. Okay, so I talked a little about a reference implementation. Here's something that we built out actually in conjunction with the VMUG folks, in something that we did during Explore US, right? Which is using these mini forms. These are really popular systems that are AMD based. And these systems can get up to 16 cores or 32 threads. So plentiful capacity from a CPU standpoint. And one of the nice things about these systems is that we can now reach up to 128 gigs of memory. So these have dual SODIMM slots. And right now, the largest memory capacity is basically 64 gigs, giving us 128 gigs of memory for each of these hosts. And then, of course, I can use one of these NVMe devices and turn on NVMe tiering. And depending on how aggressive you want to push your hardware, I can also maybe potentially get to double or maybe even triple the amount of memory that's available to me. Now, obviously, at some point, the physical memory needs to actually run these workloads. So there's a certain limit, but it's definitely a very powerful capability. The other nice thing is it comes with 10 gigabit SFP connectivity. These are all completely realized by ESXi. So meaning I can install ESX on there and is able to see all these different devices, right? One thing I do want to mention on the networking, or so on the CPU front, is that these systems do have different types of processor types. Initially, when these were released, there was the 9955HX series and then the 7945. As the demand for these systems in general for both home labs, AI workload workstations, these have just been kind of selling out. So now you're starting to see other types of CPU models. Highly recommend to make sure that when you purchase these systems, especially if you're purchasing more than one of these, to make sure that they're in the same CPU family. We have had folks who had to kind of purchase different and have ran into issues with like things like EBC, because these are ultimately at the end of the day consumer-based CPUs. So these are not on the VMware HCL, but they definitely meet the bar in terms of deploying a minimal VCF stack. So just something to be aware of there. Okay. And then what I've done is also taken this exact same bomb, and I've actually built this out recently. Recently shared this, and it just allows me to kind of tidy up everything. Not something that you need to do, but like I said, I've been able to add in an additional GPU into one of these systems. This is an RTX 4000, and it gives me 20 gigs of virtual memory. So it's the maximum amount of memory and the most powerful GPU for this type of a form factor, allowing me to kind of do a lot of cool things with private AI. And then obviously there's a rack that kind of racks all this stuff up. So if you're interested, you can kind of take a look at the build of materials, right? But a fairly compact type of a system, right? These kind of replace what you typically would work with, like say, like a Supermicro as an example. Okay, now that we talked a little about the hardware, some of the resources, let's take a look at, what does it take to get started? That's something that I get questions all the time. Is like, okay, I'm got all the hardware, I'm ready to go. What do I need to do, right? Especially if you're kind of new to the VCF and certainly VCF 9, because we have changed the way things are set up in general, right? You're not dialing all these different ISO OVAs. There is a much more streamlined process, and everything starts off with this new VCF depot construct, right? And there's sort of two ways in which you get these binaries as well as the metadata. And this basically is what's used by the VCF installer. This is this virtual appliance that you deploy that helps you build out your full stack and automatically deploys it. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a second. But again, the first thing to understand is that there is this depot, and you get to decide, how do you want to download the software? Now, there are two options. One is by deploying the VCF installer and then connecting that directly to Broadcom's download depot. And typically, this will require a download token that you'll go ahead and put into the VCF installer, and it automatically knows how to connect and just automatically pulls the software binaries, all the metadata automatically for you. That's sort of the easy path. And you typically will either go through directly or through a network proxy. Alternatively, you can actually set up an offline depot, or basically a depot that you would run within your environment. And you still do the same thing. You would still need to download the software. And here we do have a tool called the VCF download tool. As the name of the tool is that it automatically pulls that software down for you automatically. And then you're able to take that content and serve that over an HTTP or HTTPS endpoint, which your VCF installer is going to go then point to that depot. In both cases, You're still pulling down the metadata and the software. It just really depends on which mechanism. And most of our users tend to go with the second option, primarily because each time you deploy, you probably don't want to go out to the internet and pull those binaries. These are not small files, and you might want to redeploy. So imagine if you messed up and you need to delete the installer. You now need to go and download those bits all over again, right? So to save on bandwidth, to save on waiting for this download to come down, most of our users create an offline depot. So I won't go through the interactive UI because you just deploy the VCF appliance and you go and just plug in your download token. But I will talk a little bit about the experience in creating the offline depot because again, like I said, this is probably the most common mechanism. And so here, what you see is the command line tool. It's a multi-platform, and you can download the tool. And here we're specifying the binaries. And the nice thing about this is that when you specify these different parameters, they'll automatically pull down both the binaries as well as the metadata. So here I'm going to do a download. I'm going to specify the version that I want. The latest version that we have of VCF is 9.0.1. And then I'm going to download all the different, just the installation binaries. We do have binaries that can be installed as a day end operation and even upgrade files. And then I reference my download token. So I put my download token into that file. And then I specify where I want this to be downloaded to on my local system. So in this case, I have a directory called /depot. And when I run this, it takes some amount of time and it's automatically going to pull down, again, all the binaries and all the metadata that's needed to deploy my initial VCF9 stack. So if I looked into that directory after some amount of time, this is the structure that you would see. Now, this is the experience you would get for customers that are entitled to the VCF software or VVF software, right, that can generate a download token. Now, one of the questions that I know that many are asking, especially since this is a VMUG event, is, well, what about the VMUG Advantage users? What can I do there? Now, I don't know if Eric has already done his session or not, but just as a quick recap, we are working on getting both the licensing for VMUG Advantage users who have successfully passed their VCF certification, as well as allowing you to generate your own download tokens. So that's great news because what that means is that as a VMUG Advantage user, your experience in setting up VCF will be no different than our regular users who have the ability to generate download tokens. So that's the same experience. But if you're a user right now who wants to just get started, and this is before November 24th, so just in a couple weeks' time, that's when that should hopefully launch. There is a workaround. And what we've done is we've hosted the metadata files on the Broadcom support portal. So today, as a VMUG Advantage user who's successfully passed their VCF certification, you can already go download the software. One of the things that's not there today was the metadata. So we kind of fixed that back several months back. So now you can go to the Broadcom support portal, download this metadata, and unzip that into a local directory. Now, when I do that, what you'll see is the same structure, but it's just the metadata files, right? And then step 2 of that process, or 1B, is now to go into the Broadcom support portal, and you're already entitled to download VCF9 software. So you go and just download just the components that's needed to deploy the initial stack. And after I've downloaded that, you go in and place them in the respective directory. So you'll see that this screenshot is exactly the same that we saw earlier using a download token. The only difference here is that by using the download token, it automatically does this all for you. And before the launch of the VMUG licensing, again, sometime in the next couple of weeks, this is sort of the workaround where you'll download the metadata file manually. You'll go and download the binaries, put them all in this directory structure, and you're off to the races. So now that we've downloaded all the software that's needed, we'll go in and then, oh, sorry, before we actually talk about that, once you've got all the binaries and metadata, one of the things we need to do is make this available, right? So that way our VCF installer and eventually SDDC manager, which is a component that will lifecycle all your different solutions, you need to kind of point to that directory. Now, one option is to deploy this using a typical web server. You might use Apache or something like that. But you can even use something more simpler, especially if you're just setting this up in a lab environment. You can just use sort of like a Python module. And there's this nice little Python script that I put together that allows you to basically serve that directory that I just talked about, the /depot. And some additional things that's needed is if you need to set up HTTPS. So you just need to generate a TLS certificate. And then here I can specify the username and password. And once you run this little script, you're then able to open up a browser and navigate to this address, and you can see the files there. It's automatically being served over an HTTP S endpoint. And you have the ability to also serve this over HTTP if needed. So it just makes it very easy for you to take the binaries that you've downloaded, make it available over a web server, and then we can start to connect to it using the VCF installer. Okay, so now we talked about a little bit about the VCF installer, right? This is a virtual appliance that you'll go in and download and install, and this basically is the installer that helps you walk through and deploying the full VCF 9 stack. So very first step here when we download is, again, like I said, you have two methods to connect to the software depot. I can connect to Broadcom's website, or you can connect to your offline depot. In this screenshot here, I'm connecting to an offline depot that I've created, and we go ahead and download all of that software. That's so once we've done that, we can then proceed to actually start to go and deploy our VCF stack. I won't go through each of the screenshots, but one of the really nice things about this UI is it's very interactive. It does all the validation, so things like DNS, NTP, did you pull down all the software binaries that you needed, and helps you kind of walk you through. And then at the very end, before you deploy it, as you can see on the right-hand side, actually you can download the specification. So this makes it very easy for you to redeploy this environment. Or if I wanted to change the deployment environment, let's say I wanted to maybe deploy NSX Manager highly available mode, I can quickly tweak the JSON and I can really import that back in, which is a much better experience than I had in the past, where I had to use the UI as an example, or sorry, the APIs to basically deploy it. Here, I can actually provide the JSON back into the UI, and I can actually edit the wizard. So I can actually go back down and take a look at what things I changed in the JSON. How does that influence the UI, right? Once we pass all the validation, I can click on deploy, and the deployment will begin. And this can take several hours, right? It all just depends on your physical resources, your lab environment, et cetera. But once you're done, right, you'll go and deploy all the different components, and you'll see a landing page like this. That'll take you to the VCF operations page, right, after you deployed your brand new VCF fleet. So really straightforward. And again, the nice thing about this is I'm able to take this JSON specification and I can use this to automate for future deployments, right? So as I learn about deploying this in a lab POC environment, the JSON that you're able to download directly from the product, I can now change things like host names, passwords, configuration changes, and I can take that exact same JSON specification and now use that to deploy my production environments, right? And so if you need to deploy this n number of different times, maybe we have some edge locations, I can easily codify this and I can actually source control this configuration, which makes it really easy to deploy. Whereas in the past, you had to kind of jump through multiple hoops and creating this JSON configuration file and only deploy using the APIs. Okay, we're now going to jump into some of the tips and tricks that's available too to really make it easier for you to deploy a full VCF 9 experience. And in some cases, even reducing some of the requirements that's needed or working around some of the constraints that you might have within your lab environment, right? Not everybody has production grade hardware. And so I just want to make you aware of some of these tips and tricks. Some of these are applicable to 9.0 and some of these are applicable to 9.0.1. So it'll be annotated as such, but I just wanted to kind of summarize some of the more common things that have come up as potential challenges. And I want to share with you some of the workarounds that's available to you. So one of the first thing is around minimum number of hosts, number of physical host requirements, right? Now, officially, the product supports sort of the following storage options, right? If you're using vSAN, we require a minimum of 3 hosts. Now, if you look back at VCF 5.x, or for those of you familiar with 5.x, we required you to have 4 hosts. So really nice that we can lower the bar there and only require 3 hosts. If you're using NFS or using fiber channel storage, you need a requirement of 2 hosts. Now the question, tends to come up is like, could I get away with less number of hosts for either of these storage options? And the answer is absolutely yes. Now, obviously, there's no availability story as you reduce the number of hosts. But if you're interested and you have the amount of resources, especially on the memory front, like I mentioned earlier, you can deploy, the full VCF 9 stack on a single host. And here's a configuration parameter that you can easily apply to the VCF installer or SDDC manager. Sorry, I'm going to get some water real quick. That will allow you to deploy the solution. And this is useful, obviously, for the initial deployment. But if you're adding additional nodes or like a workload domain, you may still want to also reduce the number of nodes here. So again, this is applicable for both VCF installer as well as the SDDC manager. So definitely a handy one that you'll need to apply. The second one is around the networking requirements. Now, ideally, we have hardware that can support 10 gigabit networking, especially for those that are thinking about things like vSAN, but even for non-vSAN, you probably still want to have some decent connectivity. But not everybody has 10 gigabit connectivity available, right? So One of the things that we can do now is within the VCF install, and there is a pre-check, and this is something that we've had even in the 5.x days, right? And back in the 5.x, there was an override where you had to use the API. So that wasn't really useful because it didn't provide you with the most a great user experience. And so here we do have a mechanism where you can actually override the installer, basically bypass the 10 gigabit networking connectivity. So if you have gigabit or 2.5 gigabits, you can still deploy. So you apply this particular configuration setting in the VCF installer, restart the service, the pre-check will bypass and it will just say, hey, you don't have 10 gigabit, but we're not going to fail it as a hard error. Whereas in the 5.x days, it was a hard error unless you use the API, which isn't always easy to use sometimes, right? Especially if you want to use the UI. So this is a nice little workaround there. And that was for the VCF installer. Now, the other thing that was there in 5.x that we didn't really have a workaround even in 9.0 when we first GA is that even if you override the networking during the initial installation, if you wanted to add an additional host, or if you wanted to add, say, like a workload domain, we did have a separate pre-check that would happen in SCDC Manager that still mandated the 10 gigabit NICs. And there hasn't been a solution for that, right? So while you can work around the day zero, if you needed to add more capacity to your initial management cluster, or if you wanted to deploy like a workload cluster and you didn't have 10 gigabit, you're kind of out of luck, which was really unfortunate. And luckily, this is something that our engineering team has fixed and resolved. So in the VCF 9.0.1 release, you now have the ability to also bypass that at the SCDC manager layer. So again, log into my SCDC manager component. I just simply add this configuration and restart the process. And now this hard failure will just turn into a warning and allow you to proceed. So this is really useful if you, again, if you want to add additional capacity or if you want to add this, add like a workload domain. So this is new in 9.0.1. So if you're considering deploying VCF Stack, definitely start with 9.0.1. There's a lot of cool capabilities that we've added to this minor patch release, and some of these bypasses are definitely there for that as well. So that's on the networking front. Now, another common one that we see all the time is around the vSAN requirement. A lot of users are interested in playing with vSAN, especially with ESA. But one of the things that we really strive for in terms of an out-of-the-box experience is to make sure that you're using hardware that's on the HCL. Now, it was designed to make sure that you had a good production-grade experience, but we all understand that from a lab POC standpoint, you might not have hardware that's on the HCL, or in some cases, you might have hardware that's pending the HCL. And today, this is a hard failure. And while there has been some solutions around installing sort of this mock VIB that I produced that basically allows you to fake it, you still have to jump through multiple hoops because I got to go to each and every single one of these ESX hosts, install this VIB, restart the services, come back. And so in 9.0.1, we've simplified this further. So in the VCF installer, we can actually now turn this pre-check that used to be a failure into more of a warning. Right, so you'll still see a warning and say, hey, you've got hardware that you're trying to use for a vSAN ESA. We certainly don't recommend it for production, but if you understand that and you want to proceed, we now have the ability to override this and turn this into a warning. And the nice thing here is that instead of having to mess with my ESX host and maybe I might to make additional changes, I can now do this at one place, which is the VCF installer, and now I can easily go through the validation and proceed with my deployment. So this really streamlines for lab POC types of environments where you may not have hardware that's on the HCL. So definitely a nice addition. Like I said, that's in the 9.0.1 release. And then similarly, we have this exact same pre-check happening at the SCDC manager level. Just like on networking, we didn't really have a solution where I had to, if I wanted to add a new workload domain, or if I want to, if I wanted to extend my existing management domain, I would still run into the same problem. And because these are different types of pre-checks, these would be treated as hard failures. So again, in 9.0.1, we have the ability to override these, right? And basically turn these into warnings rather than failures. So for day two, I would then log into my SCDC manager. I would then apply these feature flag configurations, and then now I can actually proceed with that. So these are just some of the new options that's available to you. A lot of these are folks have been asking for because you used to have to jump through hoops, even including myself. So this definitely makes it a lot more of a seamless effort for you to kind of get started, especially from a lab environment standpoint. Now, earlier I mentioned that we talked about downloading the offline the software depot, right? And you gotta have to serve it over HTTPS, with basic authentication. Now, typically that is sort of the out of the box experience to make sure that you have the most secured environment. But if you're just talking about a lab environment, I might not want to do it over HTTPS. You have to either request a certificate or you got to create a certificate. So one of the nice workarounds is I can actually disable HTTPS and just simply use HTTP. So if you're able to serve up this content over just a standard web server, maybe you're just using Apache or using something like a Synology, which is what I'm using, you can actually disable the HTTPS check. So again, going into the VCF installer or SCDC manager component, and then adding this parameter here that says HTTPS enable and just turn it false. And now I can actually serve that content over HTTP, and it just lowers the bar for you to get started, right? So these are just some of the workarounds. There's a lot of other tips and tricks that's listed on my blog, but these are just some of the top ones that just really makes it easier for you to kind of just get started. So in summary, I really just want to say that, everything that you've heard about the VCF9 platform, especially the latest release of 9.0.1, you can do in this reference implementation that I talked about, right? Whether it's playing with some of the new fleet management capabilities so you can kind of modernize your operations, playing with modern workloads, playing with supervisors, VKS. I'm sure you've heard a lot about that. Maybe you're interested in some of the storage technologies using ESA. And using, a form factor like the MSA2, you're able to really get that full experience, not just from infrastructure point of view, workload consumption, but also some of our private AI and some of the advanced capabilities, whether we're talking about like vDefend and some of these other add-ons, whether it's DR, et cetera, right? So really the point here is that there is enough capabilities out of the box for you to really experience the full VCF9 stack without having to have production grade environment. And in fact, these past 4 or 5 months since the general availability of VCF9, I've been documenting my own personal experience of going through this whole build out, from the physical BOM all the way up to deploying, NSX with VPCs, supervisors, playing with VKS, how do I play with VCF automation, private AI. And so I've documented all of this step by step. Along with a bunch of other content. And again, myself and Alan Renouf, we also did a breakout at Explore. It's freely available. That kind of goes into more details in terms of what does it take to deploy a minimal lab setup. And it kind of goes through a little bit more of the step-by-step if you're really interested in. But again, lots of content available there. I think we have about maybe 10 minutes or left, so maybe we can take some questions if there are some. I know that I see a lot of a lot of things flying through chat and Q&A, so it sounds like a lively discussion. Anything, Alan, that you see that I should
Hey, William, can you hear me?
Yep, I can hear you, buddy.
Okay, cool. Yeah, there was some good questions in the Q&A. I seem
Okay.
to have lost them as I came into the webinar from the backstage, but there was definitely some questions around being able to use iSCSI in a management domain. Is that supported?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. In fact, we just recently published a KB. So while it's not directly supported in terms of the installer, because there are certain flows that's required, one of the capabilities with the VCF9 release specifically is not only deploying like a brand new VCF9 fleet. We know many of our customers are coming from different, deployment topologies and components. Some might just have vCenter and ESXi hosts. Some might have it with operations. Some might have NSX. Some might have some of the ARIA components. And so part of the VCF installer, there's an import capability. So we are able to import existing environments. And so one of the workarounds, and there's a KB that publishes the full details, is I can actually configure some additional principal storage. So as a reminder, we today support vSAN, OSA, ESA, Fiber Channel, VMFS, and NFS as sort of the principal storage for the management domain. When it comes to the workload domain, all the different storage options that we support today in vSphere are fully supported. Now, some of our customers might want to be interested in trying out things like iSCSI, maybe Fiber Channel over NVMe. So there is a capability using the import feature where I can configure all of that functionality in vCenter, and then I can actually import that environment into my VCF9 environment, and then I'll run a synchronization between the SCDC manager component and the underlying vCenter server. So it's aware of all this information. So yes, you can definitely do that today.
Thanks, William. There was a question I accidentally hit that you're going to answer live, but is Holodeck 9 still actively being developed? Yes, it is, and there was recently a blog post and a release
Yep, that's
of
right.
that. So yes,
Yeah.
there's been a
Yeah,
bunch of
holodeck is
questions
just
about.
another solution to it. It's a fantastic solution because it's kind of like a SCDC in a box. Now, obviously, you do need to have the physical resources to run, but that does all use nested virtualization. But if you're looking for something that just, everything runs in there, including virtual networking, it is definitely a fantastic solution that's available to you.
There's lots of questions asking for the recording of this session. It will be available as part of the VMUG YouTube channel. There's also questions asking for the deck that you're using, but I think this slide here pretty much covers everything that you've spoken about, right? And
For
where to
sure.
find it. Okay.
Yeah, and I did see there were some questions around, all the different bypasses. And so if you look at that first link there, it kind of goes to sort of my main VCF9 page, and it does break it down by all the different components, and you'll see all the different overrides. And so part of deploying the minimal VCF9 lab, I do have a GitHub repository that just summarizes all the things that you need to do a minimal deployment. And so it's got all those steps outlined. I've actually written additional automation scripts, so you don't even need to read the blog post. I basically put it into code so that you can just run it step by step. And in fact, I had a colleague this week just go through that and super happy about that. So you can follow the GitHub repository. So that's actually linked in there. But if you just wanted to read about these resources or others, that main VCF9 link that you see here on this page here, that also captures all of that as well.
Someone's asking your take on VxRail for VCF9.
VxRail, my take on VxRail. I haven't played with VxRail in a while, so I'm not sure. But I believe we do have some support for VxRail. I don't remember the exact details on that, but yeah, we definitely have some initial support. Let's see, I see GA, HOL, oh, HOL 9.0. I'm not sure where, I thought we had some HOLs for 9.0. I'm actually not sure
Yeah,
where
there
those.
is. There definitely
Okay.
is
Yeah, I'm
some
pretty
in
sure
the
there is. Yeah,
hands-on
same with
notes.
the Holodeck. Holodeck has already GA'd already. In fact, we have a 9.0.1 release that just came out. I think somebody shared the blog post actually in the webinar chat. So yeah, that's all been available for a number of months now. Let's see. Any other
So
questions?
there was also some general questions on licensing, William, like how do people get hold of a license? There's the 90-day eval when you
Yeah, I'll talk
install,
about
but
high level. Yeah, I can talk a little
yeah.
bit about the high level because I think some of the licensing thing has changed. I'm the wrong person to talk about licensing. But if you look at the product out of the box, one of the things that we also wanted to make it easy for folks is just deploy and get started. So I'm sure many of you are familiar that, licensing used to be 60 days, right? You deploy ESX, it's up for 60 days, you get all the features, and then by day 60, ideally you license it or you reinstall. We've actually extended that. So now all the components can be deployed in 90-day in evaluation mode. And that's by default. You don't need to do anything. Now, as VMUG Advantage users, or for folks that are VMUG Advantage users who have gone and taken their certification, you do have a path to get 128. Let me repeat that, 128 VCF cores that's available to you. So roughly speaking, you can get 4 of these hosts, fully license it up, and deploy your full stack. And depending on what you're doing, you can certainly get away with some interesting deployment configuration. And simply just by completing your certification, and then becoming a VMUG Advantage users. And like I said earlier in the presentation, once you go through that process, you'll get access to the VMUG portal, and you'll be able to generate a download token the exact same way that a regular, customer would go through. So there's no difference in that, right? I know it took us a little bit longer because we had to kind of work on the back end with Broadcom, but that's all been done. And I think Eric Nielsen even talked about that actually in one of his presentations today, or if it will be later today, that walks you through that entire process, right? So once you've got your certification, you're a VMUG Advantage member, and you get this for 3 years, by the way, right? So year one, you get the 128 cores, and then I think for year 2 and 3, I think there's like a small delta if there are some micro changes to it, and then you take that. So now you get up to 3 years worth of full VCF platform with 120 cores. So pretty nice offering there for those of you that are looking at reasons to get your certification. This is a great reason, and obviously you have full access to the licensing, so you can play with the full stack and not really worry about reinstallation or messing with evaluations and all that.
Thanks. I think we've pretty much covered all the questions, and I know we're nearly out of time. One final comment is there's a lot of love for you in the chat and the questions. So everybody's saying thank you so much for your website and thanks for doing a great job. And
I
the last
appreciate
question I'll leave you with is, will you be running for president?
it. President of my blog, sure. Uh,
Thanks, William. I think
I
I say
appreciate it.
thank you
Thanks
on
for your
behalf
folks'
of
time.
everybody.
Great questions. Take care.